The taste of copper still floods my mouth every time I think about that first translation into the Immaterium. My name is Navigator Katarina Vex, and I am the only living soul who remembers every single warp jump I've ever made. Every single one. You think that makes me blessed by the Emperor's light, touched by divine providence. But you don't know what I've seen writhing in the spaces between reality. What whispers follow me through 47 years of service aboard the battlecruiser Endless Vigilance. They say a navigator who retains perfect memory of the warp is either a saint or a heretic. After 12,047 jumps through the screaming void, watching demons tear at the Geller field, while my mind catalogued every detail with perfect clarity, I can tell you which one I am. This is my testimony before the Inquisition comes for me. Chapter 1. The Awakening Eye. The smell of incense and machine oil filled the navigator's sanctum aboard the Endless Vigilance, as I prepared for what I thought would be just another routine translation to the Macharius system. I was 19 years old, fresh from the Navis Nobilite training academies on Terra, and arrogant enough to believe I understood what it meant to guide an Imperial vessel through the warp. The ceremonial brass fittings of my throne gleamed under the amber glow of lumens, each surface polished to perfection by servitors who had maintained this chamber for centuries before my arrival. My predecessor, Navigator Quintus Hadrax, had died during a warp storm 3 months prior. The ship's records indicated he had served for 93 years, his mind gradually consumed by the accumulated horrors of 8,000 warp translations. When they found his body in this very throne, his third eye had been burned out from the inside, leaving only a cauterized socket weeping tears of silver. The ship's chroniclers recorded it as a peaceful death, a navigator's final gift to the Emperor after a lifetime of faithful service. I had believed their lies completely. The bridge vox crackled to life, Captain Mordian's gruff voice cutting through the chamber's silence. Navigator Vex, we're ready for translation on your mark. Destination: Macharius Prime Orbital Yards. The Geller field generators report optimal function across all decks. I pressed the activation rune on my throne's arm, feeling the familiar tingle as the ship's systems synchronized with my neural pathways. Acknowledged, Captain. Beginning pre-translation rituals now. Estimated time to completion, 17 minutes. Those 17 minutes would change everything. The ritual began as it always did, with prayers to the God Emperor and supplications to the Omnissiah for the machine spirits that would protect us during our journey through hell. I removed the silk bandages from my third eye slowly, savoring these last moments of ignorance. The warp eye, that unnatural organ grown in the skull of every navigator bloodline, pulsed with its own inner light. Through it, I could perceive the currents of the Immaterium, even while still anchored in real space. What I saw in those first moments should have driven me insane. The warp around our position writhed with impossible geometries and colors that had no names in any human language. Streams of psychic energy twisted through dimensions that shouldn't exist, carrying the screams of 10,000 years' worth of human suffering. But instead of the merciful madness that claimed most navigators on their first deep sight into the warp, my mind simply recorded it all. Every detail, every impossible angle, every demon face that pressed against the barriers between reality and nightmare. I began the translation, guiding the Endless Vigilance into the Immaterium with practiced movements that felt strangely familiar, despite this being only my second solo navigation. The ship's Geller field activated with a subsonic hum that resonated through the hull, creating our bubble of real space physics in a realm where such concepts were merely suggestions. That's when I saw them, demons of every description pressed against our Geller field, like insects drawn to a flame. Lesser spawn of chaos writhed in perpetual agony, their forms shifting between states of matter and energy. Greater demons stalked the periphery of our passage, their attention fixed on our small island of sanity with hungry intelligence. But it was what I saw beyond them that truly shocked me. Other ships, thousands of them, locked in eternal translation, through warp currents that led nowhere. I watched a battle barge of the Iron Hands chapter drift past our starboard bow. Its hull cracked open like an egg to reveal the madness within. Space Marines, those legendary defenders of humanity, wandered its corridors in endless repetition of their final moments. Some fought demons that reformed as quickly as they were destroyed. Others had fallen to corruption, their power armor fused with their mutated flesh in configurations that hurt to observe. Through my third eye, I could see the ship's navigator still seated in his throne, his consciousness trapped in a loop of eternal translation that would never end. His lips moved in silent prayer to an emperor who couldn't hear him across the barrier of madness that separated reality from the warp. The sight should have filled me with horror. Instead, I found myself memorizing every detail of his suffering with the clinical precision of a medici documenting symptoms. The translation to Macarius Prime took 11 hours and 37 minutes. When we finally breached back into real space, I sat in my throne for another hour, processing what I had witnessed. Every other navigator I had spoken with described warp translation as a blur of impressions and half-remembered nightmares. Their minds, protected by the Emperor's mercy, allowed them to forget the specific details of what they saw in the Immaterium. Mine didn't. I could recall every demon face that had pressed against our Geller field. I remembered the exact configuration of energy patterns that had allowed us to navigate the treacherous currents around the Mandragora Nebula. Most disturbing of all, I could perfectly reconstruct the images of those trapped ships and their crews, their eternal torment now etched into my memory with crystalline clarity. Captain Mordian's voice over the Vox broke my reverie. Navigator Vex, translation successful. Our chronometer indicates we arrived 14 minutes ahead of schedule with no signs of warp taint on any deck. The Macarius Orbital Command is requesting our approach vector. Acknowledged, Captain, I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos in my thoughts. Translation complete. The Emperor protects. But as I spoke those ritual words, I wondered if the Emperor's protection extended to navigators who could remember everything they saw in his most terrible realm. The first seeds of doubt had been planted in my mind, though I wouldn't understand their significance for months to come. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into studying the ship's archives, searching for any reference to navigators with perfect warp memory. What I found in the restricted sections of the Endless Vigilance databanks chilled me more than any demon I had encountered during translation. The condition had a name: Immaterium hypermnemonic syndrome. Fewer than 1 in 10,000 navigators developed it, and those who did rarely lived long enough to complete more than a dozen translations. The archives contained 17 case studies spanning the last 3 millennia. Each followed the same pattern: initial manifestation of perfect recall, followed by increasing psychological instability, and finally, either death by madness or investigation by the Inquisition for suspected chaos corruption. Navigator Quintus Hadrax, my predecessor, had suffered from the same condition. I spent hours studying his personal logs, hidden in encrypted data stacks that required my biometric authorization to access. His early entries read like my own experiences, wonder mixed with growing horror at the perfect clarity of warp memory. But as the years progressed, his writing became increasingly erratic. He began to document patterns in the warp that suggested intelligence behind the madness. He started to believe that the Chaos Gods were speaking directly to him through the impossible geometries of the Immaterium. His final entry, recorded just 3 days before his death, consisted of a single line repeated 1,147 times. The eye sees all, and all must see the eye. I deleted his logs after reading them, then spent the next 3 days in prayer and meditation, trying to convince myself that my condition was different, that I was stronger than Hadrax, that the Emperor would protect me from the madness that had claimed him. But deep in my heart, I knew the truth. I was already changing. The perfect memories of my warp translations were beginning to affect my perception of reality. I found myself seeing warp energy patterns in the ship's architecture. I began to notice demon faces in the shadows cast by overhead lumens. Most disturbing of all, I started to hear whispers in languages that predated human civilization, voices that spoke of truths too terrible for mortal minds to comprehend. The Endless Vigilance received new orders 3 weeks after our arrival at Macarius Prime. We were to escort a convoy of merchant vessels through the Perdition Straits, a notoriously dangerous section of warp space where the barrier between reality and chaos was thin. 7 ships had been lost in the straits over the past year, their crews vanishing without a trace. As I prepared for the translation, I realized this would be my first test. Could I maintain my sanity while navigating one of the most dangerous regions of warp space with perfect memory of every horror I witnessed? Or would this be the journey that finally broke my mind, as it had broken so many others before me? Captain Mordian's voice crackled over the Vox. Navigator Vex, all ships report ready for translation. The convoy is in formation and awaiting your guidance. I activated my throne's neural interfaces and began removing the bandages from my third eye. Acknowledged, Captain. Beginning translation sequence. May the Emperor's light guide us through the darkness. But as my warp eye opened, and I gazed into the swirling madness of the Immaterium, I whispered a different prayer, one that Quintus Hadrax had written in his logs, a prayer for strength to remember everything and the wisdom to survive what those memories would make me become. The transformation had begun, though I wouldn't understand its true scope until we reached the heart of the Perdition Straits, and I discovered what waited for us there. Chapter 2. Into the Straits. The taste of ozone and burnt copper filled my mouth as we prepared to enter the Perdition Straits. Our convoy consisted of 12 vessels, the Endless Vigilance serving as escort, 6 bulk haulers carrying grain shipments to the fortress world of Karak 9, 3 smaller merchant vessels loaded with manufactured goods, and 2 Navy frigates providing additional protection. What should have been a routine escort mission through moderately dangerous warp space was about to become something far more sinister. I had spent the previous night studying star charts and warp current maps, trying to plot the safest course through the straits. The region earned its ominous name from the unpredictable nature of the Immaterium currents that flowed through it. Ships that entered the straits sometimes emerged weeks late, their crews aged decades in what should have been days. Others arrived at their destinations with no memory of the journey, their navigators catatonic or completely mad. But as I prepared for translation, reviewing the last coherent reports from ships that had successfully traversed the straits, I began to notice patterns that other navigators had missed. The missing vessels hadn't vanished randomly. Their disappearances followed a specific sequence, based on the lunar cycles of 3 dead worlds whose psychic resonance still echoed through warp space. Ships that entered the straits during certain alignment periods had a 73% higher chance of never reaching their destinations. Today's alignment was the worst possible configuration. I tried to convince Captain Mordian to delay our departure, but Imperial Navy regulations were clear. The grain shipment had a delivery deadline tied to the fortress world's defensive preparations against an approaching Orc war. Every day we delayed meant civilian casualties when the greenskins finally arrived. Navigator Vex, the captain's voice carried his usual gruff authority. I understand your concerns, but we have our orders. The convoy departs in 30 minutes. I sealed myself into the navigator's sanctum and began the pre-translation rituals with a growing sense of dread. This would be my 7th solo navigation, and each previous journey had left me with more vivid memories of the warp's horrors. The accumulated weight of those experiences was beginning to affect my daily life. I found myself dreaming in impossible colors, speaking fragments of daemonic languages during my sleep, and seeing warp energy patterns in the ship's mundane machinery. The other crew members had started to avoid me. They couldn't explain why, but something about my presence made them uncomfortable. During meals in the officers' mess, conversations died when I entered the room. Servitors occasionally malfunctioned in my vicinity, their vocal units producing sounds that resembled the whispers I heard in the warp. As I removed the silk bandages from my third eye, the familiar tingling sensation was accompanied by something new. A burning pain that originated deep in my skull and radiated outward like neural fire. Through my warp sight, I could see that the Immaterium around our position was unusually active. Psychic storms raged in the distance, their lightning composed of crystallized human emotions. Streams of tortured souls flowed past like rivers of liquid anguish. But it was what I saw waiting in the Perdition Straits that truly terrified me. Something vast and intelligent moved through the warp currents ahead of us. It wasn't a demon in any traditional sense. It was too large, too organized, too purposeful. Through my enhanced perception, I could see that it had been constructing something in the space between reality and nightmare. A structure that defied every law of physics and geometry, built from the remains of ships that had vanished in the straits over the past century. The entity became aware of my observation. Across the gulf of warp space, something that might have been an eye the size of a battle barge turned its attention toward our convoy. The psychic pressure of its gaze made my third eye weep tears of silver, but my perfect memory captured every detail of the encounter with clinical precision. I began the translation anyway. The Endless Vigilance and its charges entered the Immaterium at coordinates 847 on 923, M41, 17 minutes past the 4th hour of ship's time. The moment our Geller field activated and we crossed the barrier into warp space, I knew we were not alone. The entity I had glimpsed during my preliminary scan was waiting for us. Its attention focused on our small convoy with the patience of something that had existed since before the birth of stars. Our passage through the outer regions of the Straits proceeded normally for the first 6 hours. The merchant vessels maintained formation while I guided us along warp currents that sparkled with only minimal daemonic activity. But as we approached the heart of the Straits, where the barrier between reality and chaos was thinnest, everything changed. The first sign of trouble came from the grain hauler Divine Providence. Captain Mordian's vox crackled with the merchant captain's panicked voice. Endless Vigilance. We're detecting massive power fluctuations in our Geller field generators. Something is pressing against our barrier from outside. Through my third eye, I could see the truth. Hundreds of minor demons were swarming around the Divine Providence, but they weren't attacking randomly. They moved with purpose, following commands from the vast intelligence that lurked in the deeper currents of the Straits. The entity was testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses that it could exploit. All ships maintain course and heading, Captain Mordian ordered. Navigator Vex, how long until we clear the Straits? I consulted the warp current charts while simultaneously tracking the movement of the entity through dimensions that existed outside normal spacetime. 11 hours, 17 minutes at current speed, Captain. But I'm detecting massive disturbances ahead. Something is interfering with the natural flow of the Immaterium. What I didn't tell him was that the entity was herding us, using minor demon swarms to force our convoy along a specific route. We weren't just traveling through the Perdition Straits, we were being guided towards something the creature had built in the deepest part of warp space. The second attack came without warning. The merchant vessel Golden Prophet suddenly broke formation, its captain screaming over the Vox about orders from the Emperor himself. Through my warp sight, I watched as a greater demon of Jinch materialized inside the ship's bridge, its presence overwhelming the minds of the crew. But this was not a random incursion. The daemon had been summoned by the entity as part of a larger plan. Golden Prophet has gone dark, Captain Mordian reported. All attempts at communication have failed. Navigator, can you determine their status? I focused my third eye on the wayward merchant vessel, piercing through the layers of warp distortion that surrounded it. What I saw would have driven any normal navigator into immediate madness. The ship's crew had been transformed into something that was neither human nor demon, their bodies twisted into living conduits for warp energy. They were building something in the ship's hold, a massive psychic amplifier that would allow the entity to extend its influence into real space. The ship is lost, Captain, I reported, my voice steady despite the horror I was witnessing. I detect massive warp corruption throughout the vessel. We need to destroy it before... My words were cut off, as the Golden Prophet exploded in a burst of psychic energy that rippled through both real space and the Immaterium. But this wasn't destruction. It was transformation. The ship's death throes created a breach in the Geller field of the grain hauler Divine Providence, allowing lesser demons to flood into its corridors. I watched through my perfect perception as the crew of the Divine Providence fought a desperate battle against entities that reformed as quickly as they were destroyed. The ship's navigator, a young woman named Petra Karax, whom I had met briefly at the Macarius orbital yards, tried to seal the breach using emergency protocols, but the damage was too extensive, and the entity that controlled the straits had planned this attack with surgical precision. The Divine Providence lasted 17 minutes before its reactor went critical. The explosion created another psychic shockwave, this one strong enough to damage the Geller fields of 2 more merchant vessels. I realized with growing horror that this was a cascade failure. Each ship's destruction weakened the defenses of the others, creating a chain reaction that would eventually consume our entire convoy. "Captain," I said over the vox, my voice tight with concentration as I tried to navigate around the spreading chaos. "We need to abort the mission. The enemy is using our own ships as weapons against us." "Negative, Navigator. We have our orders. How many ships can you save?" I performed rapid calculations, factoring in the deteriorating warp conditions, the increasing demon activity, and the malevolent intelligence that orchestrated everything from the deeper currents of the straits. If we maintain current course, none of them. The entity controlling this region has planned a trap that uses our standard navigation protocols against us. Entity. Navigator, you're not making sense. There are no entities in warp space, only demons and the random chaos of the Immaterium. But I could see the truth with perfect clarity. The thing that waited for us in the heart of the straits wasn't a demon. It was something far older and more dangerous. A fragment of intelligence from the war in heaven, trapped in the warp for 65 million years and slowly growing in power. It had learned to manipulate the chaotic energies of the Immaterium, using them to construct a fortress of impossible architecture from the hulks of ships that had vanished in the straits over the centuries. The fortress was almost complete. It only needed a few more vessels to finish the psychic amplifier that would allow it to project its influence across entire star systems. Our convoy represented the final components it required for its grand design. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my service. Instead of following the safe currents that led directly through the straits, I began to guide our remaining ships along a route that took us closer to the entity's fortress. If I was going to save the surviving vessels, I needed to understand exactly what we were facing. The structure that emerged from the swirling chaos of warp space defied every principle of engineering and architecture. Ships from a dozen different eras had been fused together into a vast spiral that stretched across multiple dimensions. I could see Imperial Navy cruisers from the Great Crusade welded to Eldar craft, whose designs predated humanity as expansion into the stars. Orc rocks had been incorporated as structural supports, their crude machinery somehow harmonizing with the elegant curves of ancient human colony ships. At the center of this impossible construction sat something that might once have been a Necron tomb ship. Its hull gleamed with the same living metal I had seen in archived footage of the Macarian heresy, but it had been transformed by 65 million years of exposure to chaos. Psychic energy flowed through channels carved into its surface, creating patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The entity resided within this ship, its consciousness distributed through the entire fortress like a vast neural network. Through my third eye, I could sense its attention focusing on our convoy with the intensity of a star going nova. It spoke to me across the gulf of warp space, its voice carrying harmonics that existed in frequencies beyond human perception. "Navigator," it whispered, the words bypassing my ears entirely and resonating directly in my enhanced mind. "You see truly. You remember all. Come to me, and I will show you wonders that no human has ever witnessed." The psychic pressure of its communication nearly overwhelmed my defenses, but my perfect memory recorded every nuance of the encounter. I realized that the entity had been watching me specifically, studying my condition through the psychic traces I left during each warp translation. It knew about my hypermnemonic syndrome, and it wanted to use my perfect recall for its own purposes. I guided the remaining ships away from the fortress, using emergency warp currents that I had memorized from my study of the Perdition Straits charts. The route was dangerous. It took us through regions where the barrier between reality and chaos was so thin that unprotected humans would be driven instantly insane. But it was our only chance of escape. Of the 12 vessels that had entered the Straits, only 5 emerged into real space at the Karak 9 system. The Endless Vigilance, 2 grain haulers, and 1 Navy frigate had survived the journey. 7 ships and nearly 3,000 souls had been lost to feed the entity's grand design. As we limped into orbit around Karak 9, Captain Mordian summoned me to his quarters for a debriefing. The aged officer studied me with eyes that had seen 4 decades of service in the Imperial Navy, searching for signs of the warp taint that affected all who spent too long in the Immaterium. "Navigator Vex," he said carefully. "Your report mentions an intelligent entity controlling the Perdition Straits. The Navis Nobilite teaches that the warp contains only demons and chaotic energy. How can you be certain of what you observed?" I looked directly into his eyes, knowing that my next words would determine whether he trusted me or reported me to the Inquisition as a potential heretic. "Because I remember everything, Captain. Every detail, every moment. I have perfect recall of every second we spent in warp space." His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Perhaps understanding, perhaps fear. "And you believe this condition allows you to perceive things that other navigators cannot?" "I know it does, sir. The question is whether that makes me an asset to the Imperium or a threat to humanity's survival." Captain Mordian was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical displays that showed the deployment of Imperial forces against the approaching Orc War. Finally, he spoke. "Navigator Vex, you saved 5 ships and 1,500 lives during that passage. Whatever you saw in the Straits, you used that knowledge to bring us home. That makes you an asset in my book." But as I left his quarters and returned to the Navigator's sanctum, I carried with me the memory of the entity, his final words. "You cannot run from what you are becoming, little navigator. I will be waiting when you are ready to embrace your true nature." The transformation was accelerating, and I was beginning to understand that my perfect memory was not a blessing or a curse. It was preparation for something far more significant than I had ever imagined. Chapter 3. The Revealed Pattern. The psychic scream that echoed through the warp as we departed Karak 9 made my teeth ache and my third eye weep tears of molten silver. 3 weeks had passed since our encounter in the Perdition Straits, but the entity's presence followed us like a shadow cast by something that existed in too many dimensions. Every time I opened my warp sight for routine navigation checks, I could feel its attention pressing against the barriers of my mind, patient and inexorable as the heat death of the universe. The Endless Vigilance had been assigned to escort duty along the Macarius Reach, a relatively stable corridor of warp space that connected 17 Imperial worlds. It should have been peaceful work, the kind of assignment that allowed a navigator to recover from traumatic warp encounters and rebuild their psychological defenses. Instead, it became the journey where I discovered the true scope of what was happening to my mind. Captain Mordian had been receiving increasingly urgent Vox transmissions from Naval Command. Ships throughout the sector were reporting navigation anomalies, with navigators describing warp visions that seemed too coherent to be simple hallucinations. 3 vessels had failed to arrive at their destinations, their last communications describing architectural impossibilities in regions of warp space that had been stable for centuries. I knew what they were seeing because I had mapped the entire network during my perfect recollection of our passage through the Straits. The entity I had encountered wasn't working alone. It was part of something vast and ancient, a collection of intelligences that had been trapped in the warp since the end of the war in heaven, 65 million years ago. They called themselves the Architects. and they had spent eons learning to manipulate the chaotic energies of the Immaterium. What I had seen in the Perdition Straits was just one node in a network that spanned entire sectors of Imperial space. The architects were building something in warp space, a structure that would allow them to break through into real space with enough force to shatter the barriers that kept chaos contained. But they needed specific components to complete their work, and those components could only be acquired by manipulating Imperial shipping routes and sacrificing vessels at precise coordinates throughout the galaxy. My perfect memory had recorded not just the visual details of the entity's fortress, but also the psychic resonance patterns that connected it to other nodes in the network. I could see the entire web of connections stretching across the Imperium like cancer through a human body. Worse, I realized that my hypermnemonic syndrome wasn't a random mutation. It was a deliberate creation of the architects, designed to produce navigators who could perceive their grand design with enough clarity to serve as willing agents. Every navigator who developed perfect warp memory eventually received the same choice: serve the architects and gain knowledge beyond human comprehension, or be destroyed as a threat to their carefully laid plans. I had been fighting against their influence for weeks, using prayer and meditation to maintain my loyalty to the Emperor, but the weight of perfect memory was becoming unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fortress in the Perdition Straits with absolute clarity. I could recall every surface detail of the twisted architecture, every psychic current that flowed through the impossible structure, every demon face that had pressed against our Geller field during the attack. The knowledge was changing me on a fundamental level. I found myself thinking in mathematical concepts that didn't exist in baseline human consciousness. I began to perceive time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression. Most disturbing of all, I started to understand the daemonic languages I heard in the warp, their alien syntax becoming as familiar as High Gothic. 3 days out from Karak 9, I made a discovery that shattered what remained of my faith in the Imperium's teachings about the nature of the warp. We were escorting a single merchant vessel, the Sacred Promise, through a routine translation to the Forge world of Metallica Prime. The journey should have taken 18 hours through well-mapped warp currents, but as I guided our ships into the Immaterium, I detected massive disturbances in regions that the charts indicated were completely stable. Through my third eye, I could see that something had been systematically altering the warp currents throughout the Macarius Reach. Entire rivers of psychic energy had been redirected, creating new pathways that led directly to architect construction sites. The network was much larger than I had initially estimated. It encompassed not just the Perdition Straits, but hundreds of star systems across a dozen sectors. But it was what I saw at the heart of the network that truly broke my understanding of reality. The architects had constructed a massive psychic amplifier at the exact center of the galaxy, hidden in a region of warp space that corresponded to the physical location of the Great Eye of Terror. The structure was impossibly vast, larger than star systems, built from the wreckage of entire civilizations that had fallen to chaos over the past 10,000 years. At its core sat something that might have been terror itself, or perhaps a perfect replica constructed from crystallized human faith and suffering. On this shadow terror, a figure that resembled the God Emperor sat upon a throne built from the bones of extinct species. But this wasn't the benevolent protector of humanity that I had worshipped since childhood. This was something older and more terrible. A consciousness that had manipulated human development for millennia, guiding our species toward a destiny that would serve its own incomprehensible purposes. The revelation hit me with the force of a psychic thunderbolt. The Emperor was one of the architects. Every prayer I had ever spoken, every moment of faith I had experienced, every time I had called upon his protection during warp translation, all of it had been directed toward an entity that was fundamentally alien to human existence. The Imperium itself was part of the architect's grand design, a machine for harvesting human psychic energy and converting it into the raw materials needed for their ultimate construction project. I screamed. The psychic shock of this realization erupted from my third eye like a nova, momentarily destabilizing the Geller fields of both our ships. For 17 seconds, the Endless Vigilance and the Sacred Promise existed in a state of partial translation, neither fully in real space nor completely within the warp. During those 17 seconds, every human soul aboard both vessels experienced visions of the true nature of reality. Captain Mordian's voice over the Vox was tight with barely controlled panic. "Navigator Vex, what's happening? We're detecting massive energy fluctuations throughout the ship. 17 crew members have collapsed with neural trauma." I forced myself to stabilize our translation, pushing the terrible revelation to the back of my mind while I focused on the immediate crisis. The merchant vessel, Sacred Promise, was drifting off course, its navigator apparently catatonic from the psychic shock. I extended my awareness to encompass both ships, guiding us through warp currents that suddenly seemed alien and hostile. "Translation anomaly, Captain," I reported, my voice steady despite the chaos in my thoughts. "A psychic storm passed through our position. Both ships are secure, but we need immediate medical attention for affected crew members." But even as I spoke those words, I knew that what had happened went far beyond a simple navigation error. The revelation I had experienced was too specific, too detailed to be dismissed as a warp-induced hallucination. My perfect memory had recorded every detail of the Shadow Terror and its impossible throne room, and I could replay the vision with absolute clarity. The God Emperor I had seen wasn't human. It never had been. Over the following hours, as we completed our translation to Metallica Prime, I struggled to process the implications of what I had witnessed. If the Emperor was truly one of the architects, then the entire structure of Imperial society was built on a lie. The Space Marines who defended humanity were unknowing servants of an alien intelligence. The Inquisition, which hunted chaos cultists and heretics, was actually protecting the very entity they claimed to oppose. Worse, my perfect memory meant that I couldn't simply dismiss the revelation as madness. Every detail was recorded with photographic precision in my enhanced consciousness. I could see the alien script carved into the throne, translating automatically in my mind to reveal truths about human history that contradicted everything I had been taught. When we reached Metallica Prime, I requested permission to access the Forge World's most ancient archives. Captain Mordian, still shaken by the translation anomaly we had experienced, granted my request without question. He probably assumed I was researching navigation hazards to prevent future incidents. What I found in the deepest data vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus confirmed my worst fears. Hidden among the fragmentary records from the Dark Age of technology were references to archaeological discoveries that had been suppressed by Imperial authorities. Excavations on dozens of worlds had uncovered evidence of a pre-human civilization that matched the architectural style I had seen in architect constructions. The entities that built these structures had seeded life throughout the galaxy, guiding the evolution of psychic species like humanity towards specific purposes. The data fragments painted a picture of cosmic manipulation spanning millions of years. The rise and fall of the Eldar Empire, the emergence of human psychers, even the birth of the Chaos Gods themselves. All of it had been orchestrated by intelligences that existed outside normal space-time. The Warhammer 40,000 galaxy wasn't a random collection of conflicts and civilizations. It was a carefully designed engine for producing the exact type of psychic energy the architects needed for their ultimate project. I spent 3 days studying the archived data, cross-referencing it with my perfect memories of the architect network. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its scope and precision. Every major event in human history had served to push our species toward greater psychic development. The Horus Heresy, the Age of Apostasy, even the current struggles against chaos. All of it was theatre performed for an audience of alien intelligences that viewed human suffering as raw material for their construction projects. But the most disturbing revelation came when I analysed the psychic resonance patterns I had recorded during our encounter in the Perdition Straits. The entity that had spoken to me wasn't just another architect node. It was a fragment of the same consciousness that sat upon the throne of Shadow Terror. The Emperor himself had been trying to recruit me as an agent. The weight of this knowledge was becoming unbearable. I found myself unable to sleep, my mind constantly replaying the visions of Shadow Terror and calculating the implications of each detail. My appetite disappeared, and I began to lose weight as my body devoted all its energy to processing the accumulated trauma of perfect warp memory. Other crew members started avoiding me more deliberately. They couldn't explain their discomfort, but something about my presence triggered an instinctive fear response. During the daily prayer services, I found myself unable to speak the familiar litanies. The words felt like blasphemy in my mouth, knowing what I knew about the true nature of the entity we worshipped. Captain Mordian summoned me to his quarters on our last day at Metallica Prime. The aged officer studied me with the careful attention he usually reserved for enemy force dispositions, searching for signs of the warp taint that affected all who spent too long in the Immaterium. "Navigator Vex," he said carefully, "the crew is reporting unusual phenomena in your vicinity. Equipment malfunctions, disturbed sleep patterns, and general sense of unease. Can you explain what's happening?" I looked into his weathered face, seeing the concern of a man who had commanded ships for 4 decades and learned to recognize the signs of chaos corruption. How could I explain that my condition wasn't corruption in any traditional sense? That I had been deliberately altered by entities older than human civilization to serve as their agent within the Imperium? "The perfect memory is becoming more intense, Captain," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Each warp translation adds to the accumulated data in my mind. I'm beginning to perceive patterns that other navigators cannot see." "What kind of patterns?" I hesitated, knowing that my next words would determine whether he trusted me or reported me to the Inquisition. "The warp isn't as chaotic as we've been taught, sir. There are intelligences working behind the apparent madness, manipulating events across entire sectors. The missing ships, the navigation anomalies, they're all part of a larger design." Captain Mordian was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the methodical approach that had kept him alive through decades of service. "And you believe your condition allows you to perceive this design?" "I know it does, sir. The question is whether the Imperium is prepared to accept what I've discovered." He studied me for another minute, then activated a privacy field around his desk. "Navigator Vex, I'm going to share something with you that's classified at the highest levels. In my 42 years of service, I've encountered phenomena that don't match the official Imperial doctrine about the nature of chaos. I've seen evidence of coordinated intelligence behind attacks that were supposed to be random demon incursions. The Inquisition knows about these patterns, but they've chosen to classify the information rather than risk causing widespread panic." I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps there were others within the Imperial hierarchy who had begun to understand the true nature of what we faced. "What do you need me to do, Captain?" "Document everything. Every pattern you perceive, every vision you experience, every detail your perfect memory records. If there really is a coordinated intelligence manipulating Imperial shipping, then the Navy needs to understand how it operates." But as I agreed to his request, I knew I was walking a razor's edge between service to the Imperium and inevitable corruption by the very entities I was studying. The architects had been patient for 65 million years. They could afford to wait a little longer for me to complete my transformation from loyal navigator to willing agent. The next phase of my journey would take us to the edge of Imperial space, where the barriers between reality and nightmare were thinnest. It was there that I would finally understand the true scope of the architect's plan and face the choice that every navigator with perfect memory eventually confronted. But first, I had to survive the passage through the screaming vortex, where the very fabric of space-time had been torn apart by forces too terrible for human comprehension. Chapter 4. The Ultimate Test. The screaming vortex lived up to its name in ways that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. As the Endless Vigilance approached the edge of Imperial space, where the galaxy's spiral arm dissolved into the chaotic energies of unexplored void, I felt the weight of perfect memory pressing against my sanity, like a vice constructed from crystallized madness. We had been ordered to investigate the loss of 3 exploration fleets in the vortex over the past 6 months, and I knew with absolute certainty that we were flying directly into a trap designed specifically for navigators with my condition. The approach to the vortex took us through the Ghoul Stars, a region where even veteran navigators feared to travel. Here, the barriers between real space and the Immaterium had been weakened by ancient catastrophes that predated human expansion into the galaxy. Dead worlds orbited pulsars that shouldn't exist, their surfaces covered with ruins that hurt to observe directly. Through my third eye, I could see that the entire region was infested with architect constructions, their impossible geometry woven into the very fabric of space-time. Captain Mordian had assembled his most experienced crew for this mission, but I could see the strain affecting everyone aboard the ship. The closer we came to the vortex, the more frequent the equipment malfunctions became. Servitors began speaking in tongues that predated human language. Some crew members reported dreams where they walked through corridors that didn't exist on any deck plan, following voices that spoke their names in harmonies that made their bones ache. 3 days before we reached the vortex itself, I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I understood about my condition. I was conducting routine navigation checks, extending my warp sight through the local area to map the psychic currents we would need for our final translation. That's when I encountered another consciousness in the void. Not an architect entity, but something familiar yet fundamentally different. Another navigator was operating in this region, one whose psychic signature resonated with the same harmonic frequencies as my own enhanced perception. The contact was brief but revelatory. Across the gulf of space, I felt the touch of a mind that contained the same perfect clarity of warp memory that tormented my own consciousness. But this navigator had learned to control their condition, to use the accumulated knowledge of thousands of warp translations as a weapon against the very entities that had created it. Her name was Mordian Kess, and she had been hunting architects for over a century. The psychic communication that passed between us lasted only seconds, but my perfect memory recorded every detail of the exchange. Navigator Kess had served aboard an Inquisition black ship for 93 years, using her hypermnemonic syndrome to map architect networks throughout the galaxy. She had discovered ways to disrupt their constructions, methods to turn their own temporal manipulation against them, and most importantly, techniques for maintaining human identity while swimming in oceans of alien knowledge. She was waiting for us at the edge of the screaming vortex, aboard a vessel that existed in 3 dimensions simultaneously. I convinced Captain Mordian to alter our approach vector, claiming that I had detected dangerous warp currents in our planned route. In reality, I was guiding us toward a rendezvous with Navigator Kess and her mysterious ship. The vessel that appeared on our augury arrays 3 hours later shouldn't have been able to exist according to any known principles of Imperial technology. The ship was called the Temporal Meridian, and it had been constructed using techniques learned from studying architecture. Its hull curved through dimensions that human engineers couldn't perceive, creating internal spaces that were larger than the external structure. The vessel could exist partially within the warp while maintaining real space coherency, allowing it to travel through the Immaterium without relying on traditional Geller field technology. When Navigator Kess transported aboard the Endless Vigilance, I understood immediately why the Inquisition had trusted her with such a dangerous mission. She was ancient beyond measure, her body kept alive by technology that blended Imperial science with xenotech principles that had been forbidden for millennia. But it was her eyes that truly marked her as something beyond baseline humanity. All 3 of them glowed with the same silver fire that I had seen in my own reflection after each perfect warp translation. "Navigator Vex," she said in a voice that carried harmonics from too many dimensions. "You've been seeing the pattern for months now. The question is whether you're strong enough to help me destroy it." She led me to the Navigator's sanctum, where Captain Mordian had granted us privacy for what he assumed would be a technical consultation about warp conditions in the vortex. What she revealed instead was the culmination of a century-long investigation into the true nature of the architect threat. "The entities you encountered in the Perdition Straits are not the architects of this conspiracy," she explained, her enhanced consciousness interfacing directly with my own to share vast volumes of data. "They are merely tools, fragments of a much larger intelligence that has been manipulating galactic development for millions of years. The true enemy exists outside conventional space-time, in a realm that the ancient Necrons called the Absolute. Through the psychic link, I experienced her memories of encounters with architect entities across dozens of star systems. She had been present during the fall of 3 entire sectors, watching as the aliens systematically harvested human psychic energy to fuel their incomprehensible construction projects. But she had also discovered ways to fight back, methods that required a navigator to embrace their perfect memory while maintaining enough human identity to resist complete assimilation. The hypermnemonic syndrome isn't random, she continued, her silver eyes boring into mine with laser intensity. It's a recruitment tool. The architects identify potential agents among navigator bloodlines and activate the condition when their plans require human operatives with specific capabilities. You've been chosen for a purpose, Vex, but that doesn't mean you have to serve it. She showed me techniques for compartmentalizing the accumulated trauma of perfect warp memory, methods for using the enhanced perception to perceive architect constructions without being overwhelmed by their alien nature. Most importantly, she taught me how to turn my condition into a weapon against the very entities that had created it. The network you've mapped extends throughout Imperial space, she explained, but it has vulnerabilities. The architects exist outside normal time, which means they experience causality differently than we do. A navigator with perfect memory can perceive their temporal manipulation and use it against them. You can change the past by altering your recollection of events. The concept was staggering in its implications. If I could learn to edit my perfect memories, I could retroactively alter the outcomes of past warp translations. Events that had already occurred could be modified, creating new timelines where architect plans failed rather than succeeded. But the process required absolute precision. A single error could erase entire star systems from existence or create paradoxes that would shatter the fabric of reality. Navigator Kess spent 6 hours teaching me the basics of temporal manipulation through memory revision. The techniques were exhausting, requiring me to maintain multiple contradictory recollections of the same events, while using my enhanced consciousness to determine which version of history should become real. By the end of the session, I had successfully altered my memory of our encounter in the Perdition Straits, creating a timeline where the Golden Prophet and Divine Providence had survived the daemon attacks. The changes rippled backwards through time, rewriting history on a fundamental level. Captain Mordian's voice over the Vox confirmed the success of my first attempt at temporal revision. Navigator Vex, we're receiving a priority transmission from the merchant vessel Golden Prophet. They're requesting permission to rejoin our convoy for the final approach to the Screaming Vortex. I stared at Navigator Kess in amazement. Ships that had been destroyed weeks ago were suddenly alive again, their crews completely unaware that they had ever died. My perfect memory contained both versions of events, the original timeline where they perished and the new history where they survived, existing simultaneously in my enhanced consciousness. This is only the beginning, Kess warned me. The architects will detect what you've done and respond accordingly. They've been planning their grand design for millions of years, and they won't allow a single navigator to disrupt their work without consequences. She was right. Even as we spoke, I could feel the attention of the entity from the Perdition Straits, focusing on our location with the intensity of a dying star. Across the galaxy, architect nodes were awakening to the threat posed by my newfound abilities. The network that had seemed so vast and invulnerable was beginning to contract, pulling its resources back to defend against an attack that came from outside their normal temporal frame of reference. The final approach to the Screaming Vortex became a running battle between human ingenuity and alien intelligence that spanned multiple dimensions of space and time. Navigator Kess and I worked together, using our combined perfect memories to map the architect defenses while simultaneously altering key events to disrupt their coordination. The Temporal Meridian and the Endless Vigilance fought a war that existed partially in the past, partially in the present, and partially in futures that might never come to pass. Through my third eye, I could see the vortex itself, a wound in reality, that the architects had been using as a testing ground for their ultimate weapon. At its heart lay a structure that dwarfed even the fortress I had seen in the Perdition Straits. This was the prototype for the galaxy-spanning construction project that would allow the architects to break through into real space with enough force to consume entire civilizations. But as we penetrated deeper into the vortex, fighting past defenses that rewrote themselves faster than we could perceive them, I began to understand the true horror of what the architects had planned. The structure at the heart of the vortex wasn't just a weapon, it was a gateway. On the other side lay a realm where the architects existed in their true form, entities so vast and alien that human consciousness couldn't survive direct contact with their presence. They weren't trying to invade our galaxy. They were trying to replace it entirely, substituting our reality with one that better suited their incomprehensible needs. Every human soul that had ever lived, every world that had ever harbored life, every star that had ever burned, all of it would be converted into raw materials for their new creation. Navigator Kess and I reached the gateway simultaneously, our vessels translating into the heart of the vortex, where the barriers between dimensions had been completely dissolved. What we found there would haunt my perfect memory for the rest of my life, and beyond. The architects' true forms were magnificent and terrible beyond description. They existed as living equations that rewrote the fundamental constants of reality through their mere presence. Time flowed backwards around them in spirals that connected every moment that had ever existed to every moment that ever could exist. They spoke in mathematics that described the birth and death of universes, their voices creating new laws of physics with each syllable. And at their head, seated on a throne built from crystallized probability itself, was the entity I had come to know as the God Emperor of mankind. But this wasn't the benevolent protector of humanity that I had worshipped since childhood. This was something that had existed since before the first stars formed, an intelligence so vast that it viewed the rise and fall of entire species as fleeting moments of entertainment. The Imperium was just one of countless civilizations it had guided through their development, harvesting their psychic potential when they reached the proper level of evolutionary sophistication. The entity that humanity worshipped as the Emperor spoke to me across dimensions that didn't have names in any human language. Navigator Vex. You have learned to swim in the deep currents of time itself. But can you bear the weight of ultimate truth? Will you serve the greater design? Or will you cling to the comfortable lies that define human existence? I felt the full force of its attention pressing against my consciousness, offering knowledge that would make me more than human, wisdom that would allow me to perceive the true structure of reality. All I had to do was surrender my humanity and accept my role as an agent of cosmic forces that made the chaos gods seem like children playing with dangerous toys. Navigator Kess grabbed my arm, her touch anchoring me to my human identity, even as the architect entity tried to overwhelm my mind with visions of transcendence. This is the choice every navigator with perfect memory faces, she shouted over the psychic storm that raged around us. Serve the greater design and lose yourself, or fight to preserve the illusion that human life has meaning. I looked at the God Emperor entity, seeing it clearly for the first time without the filters of faith and indoctrination that had shaped my perception since childhood. It was beautiful in the way that a supernova was beautiful, spectacular and terrible and utterly alien to human experience. But it was also empty of anything that I recognized as compassion or love or genuine concern for the creatures whose development it guided. I choose humanity, I said, pouring all my will into those 3 words. Whatever that means, whatever it costs, I choose the illusion over the truth. The entity's response shattered the gateway structure, sending shockwaves through dimensions that existed outside normal space-time. The screaming vortex began to collapse in on itself, its artificial geometry dissolving as the architects retreated to realms beyond human perception. Navigator Kess and I barely escaped in our respective vessels, translating back into normal warp space as the entire region folded into configurations that hurt to remember. But even as we fled the collapsing vortex, I knew that our victory was only temporary. The architects had been building their network for millions of years, and destroying one prototype wouldn't stop their ultimate plan. If anything, our intervention had forced them to accelerate their timeline. Across the galaxy, architect nodes were activating simultaneously, beginning the final phase of their construction project. The real war was just beginning, and I had committed myself to fighting against gods. Chapter 5: The Turning Point. The aftermath of our escape from the screaming vortex left me fundamentally changed in ways that went beyond the accumulation of perfect memories. For 3 days after our return to Imperial space, I existed in a state of temporal displacement. My consciousness scattered across multiple timelines as my enhanced perception struggled to process what I had witnessed at the heart of the architect's stronghold. Navigator Katarina remained aboard the Endless Vigilance during this period, using techniques she had learned over a century of fighting the alien network to help stabilize my fractured awareness. Captain Mordian had confined both of us to the Navigator's sanctum, officially for medical observation, but in reality because the rest of the crew couldn't tolerate our presence. The psychic emanations from our enhanced consciousnesses were causing widespread hallucinations throughout the ship. Servitors malfunctioned when they came within 50 meters of our location. 3 ratings had been hospitalized after experiencing visions of geometric impossibilities that their baseline human minds couldn't process. "You're learning to exist partially outside normal time," Kess explained, as she guided me through meditation exercises designed to reintegrate my scattered consciousness. "The encounter with the true architect forms has activated dormant aspects of your hypermnemonic syndrome. You're beginning to perceive reality the way they do, as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression." Through her teaching, I learned to compartmentalize the overwhelming flood of sensory data that came from existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously. My perfect memory was no longer limited to past events. I could now recall things that hadn't happened yet, future possibilities that branched out from every decision, like an infinite tree of potential outcomes. The weight of this expanded awareness should have driven me insane, but instead it brought a strange kind of clarity. I could see the architect network spread across time as well as space, their constructions existing in a state of temporal flux that allowed them to manipulate causality itself. What I had initially perceived as a vast conspiracy spanning the current galaxy was actually much more complex. The architects were simultaneously building their network in the past, present, and future, creating a structure that would retroactively have always existed once it reached completion. But I could also see something they couldn't: the human element that they consistently failed to account for in their calculations. The architects viewed our species as a collection of predictable variables, mathematical equations that could be manipulated to produce desired outcomes. They didn't understand that human unpredictability wasn't a flaw in their system. It was a fundamental aspect of our nature that made their perfect calculations impossible. Navigator Katarina had been exploiting this blind spot for decades, using humanity's capacity for irrational choice to create paradoxes that disrupted architect plans. But she'd been working alone, limited by the scope of what a single navigator could accomplish even with perfect memory and temporal manipulation abilities. What we needed was a way to coordinate resistance efforts across multiple systems, to create a network of human agents who could match the architect's galactic reach. "The Inquisition has been tracking this threat for centuries," she revealed, as we worked together to map the current state of the architect network. "But they've been fighting it using conventional methods: investigation, purging, and containment. They don't understand that this enemy exists outside normal causality. You can't defeat something that can manipulate the past by using weapons that only function in the present." She showed me archives from the Inquisition's deepest vaults, data cores that contained fragments of information gathered over millennia of contact with architect entities. The picture that emerged was staggering in its scope. Every major catastrophe in human history had been orchestrated to serve the aliens' long-term goals. The Age of Strife, the Horus Heresy, the Great Devourer's approach, all of it had been calculated to produce specific psychic resonances that fed into their construction project. But the archives also revealed something else. Other navigators throughout history who had developed hypermnemonic syndrome and used it to fight back against the alien influence. Most had been destroyed or corrupted by the overwhelming weight of perfect memory, but a few had learned to maintain their human identity while swimming in oceans of cosmic knowledge. They had passed down techniques through hidden bloodlines, creating a secret tradition of resistance that had persisted for thousands of years. "You're not the first to face this choice," Kess told me as we studied the genealogical records of navigator houses that had produced agents with our condition. "And you won't be the last. The question is whether you're willing to become part of something larger than yourself, to join a war that spans galactic history." I thought about the entity that sat on the throne at the heart of the architect realm, the being that humanity worshipped as the god emperor, but which was actually something far older and more alien than our species could comprehend. The revelation had shattered my faith in the fundamental structures of imperial society, but it had also shown me why that faith was necessary. Humans needed the illusion of divine protection, the belief that their struggles had meaning beyond mere survival. What would joining this war actually mean, I asked, knowing that my answer would determine the course of the rest of my existence. Navigator Kess activated a hidden data core that she had been carrying, its surface inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "It means becoming part of a temporal resistance network that operates across multiple dimensions of space and time. We call ourselves the Eternal Vigil, and we've been fighting this war for longer than human civilization has existed. But we've never had a navigator with your specific combination of abilities, perfect memory, temporal perception, and most importantly, the capacity to edit reality through recollection revision." The data core projected a holographic display that showed the current state of the war against the architects. Resistance cells operated on hundreds of worlds, their members drawn from every level of imperial society. Inquisitors who had learned the truth about the alien network, space marines whose enhanced physiology allowed them to perceive architect constructions, tech priests who had discovered ways to reverse engineer alien technology without being corrupted by it, even some members of the Navi's nobilite who had developed techniques for detecting architect influence in warp space. But they were losing. The architect network had reached a critical mass that allowed it to begin actively manipulating imperial policy from within. High Lords of Terror who had been subtly influenced over decades of exposure to alien psychic manipulation. Navigator houses whose bloodlines had been compromised by careful breeding programs spanning centuries. Even some space marine chapters whose gene seed had been altered to make them more susceptible to architect control. The enemy's timeline calls for final completion of their project within the next 50 years, Kess explained, highlighting regions of the galaxy where architect activity was accelerating. Once they achieve sufficient psychic resonance from human suffering, they'll be able to open permanent gateways between our reality and their realm. Everything we know, everything we are, will be converted into raw materials for their new creation. I studied the tactical display, using my enhanced perception to analyze the patterns of architect activity across time and space. The network was indeed approaching completion, but I could see vulnerabilities that the Resistance hadn't noticed. Critical nodes that, if disrupted at precisely the right moments, could create cascade failures throughout the entire structure. But exploiting those vulnerabilities would require unprecedented coordination between resistance cells, and most importantly, it would require navigators who could manipulate causality itself. I can do more than join the Resistance, I realized, my perfect memory already calculating the specific interventions needed to disrupt the architect timeline. I can change the fundamental parameters of their victory condition, but I'll need access to other navigators with hypermnemonic syndrome, and I'll need them to trust me enough to attempt coordinated temporal manipulation. Navigator Kess smiled for the first time since I had met her, the expression transforming her ancient features into something that might once have been young. That's what I was hoping you would say. The Eternal Vigil has been preparing for this moment for 3,000 years. We have 17 other navigators with your condition scattered across the galaxy, all of them waiting for someone with the skill to coordinate a simultaneous strike against the network's temporal foundations. She provided me with encrypted coordinates for contacting the other members of our group, along with authentication codes that would prove my legitimacy as a resistance operative. But she also warned me about the price that such coordination would exact on my humanity. Manipulating causality on a galactic scale requires you to exist partially outside human time, she explained. The more you use your abilities, the more you'll perceive reality the way the architects do, as a collection of variables to be optimized rather than a lived experience with inherent meaning. Some of our operatives have lost themselves completely, becoming as alien as the entities they fought against. I accepted the risk without hesitation. Whatever the cost to my individual humanity, it was a small price to pay for preserving the illusion of meaning that made human existence bearable. The alternative, allowing the architects to complete their grand design, would result in the elimination of everything I had ever cared about. Captain Mordian summoned us to his quarters that evening for a final briefing before Navigator Kess departed aboard the Temporal Meridian. The aged officer had been monitoring our activities through the ship's sensors, and his expression suggested that he understood more about our conversation than he was willing to admit. "Navigator Vex," he said carefully, "your condition appears to be stabilizing, but I'm concerned about the long-term implications of what you've experienced. The crew reports that strange phenomena continue to manifest in your vicinity, and our Geller field generators are showing stress patterns that I've never encountered in 4 decades of service." I looked into his weathered face, seeing the concern of a man who had spent his life protecting his ship and crew from threats that most humans couldn't imagine. "Captain, I need to request a transfer to special duties. The abilities I've developed require me to work with other navigators who share my condition. The Endless Vigilance will be safer with a replacement navigator who doesn't carry the temporal disturbances that my presence creates." He was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical displays that showed the deployment of Imperial forces across the sector. Finally, he spoke. "Navigator Vex, in my 42 years of service, I've learned to trust the instincts of the specialists under my command. If you believe your talents are better suited to other duties, then I'll support your transfer request. But I want you to know that you'll always have a place aboard this ship if you need it." I felt a surge of emotion at his words, perhaps the last purely human feeling I would experience for a very long time. "Thank you, Captain. That means more than you know." Navigator Kess and I departed the Endless Vigilance the following morning, transferring to the Temporal Meridian for the beginning of my training as a temporal resistance operative. As we translated into warp space, I took one last look at the battlecruiser that had been my home for the past year. Through my enhanced perception, I could see the ship's future branching out in multiple probability streams. In some timelines, it would survive the coming war against the architects. In others, it would be destroyed during battles that hadn't been fought yet. But in all of the possible futures I could perceive, Captain Mordian and his crew continued to serve with the honor and dedication that made humanity worth preserving, even if they never learned the truth about the cosmic forces that threatened their existence. The transformation was complete. I was no longer simply a navigator with perfect memory. I had become something new, a temporal guardian tasked with preserving human illusion against alien truth. The weight of galactic history rested on my shoulders, but for the first time since developing hypermnestic syndrome, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The real war was about to begin, and humanity finally had weapons that could wound gods. Chapter 6. Working through consequences. The Temporal Meridian existed in a state of controlled paradox that made every moment aboard the vessel an exercise in maintaining sanity through deliberate ignorance. As Navigator Kess guided me through the ship's impossible architecture, I learned to stop questioning why corridors led to locations that shouldn't exist, or how the same room could be reached by taking different routes that covered vastly different distances. The vessel had been constructed using principles learned from centuries of studying architect technology, and attempting to understand its design with baseline human logic was a guaranteed path to madness. My training as a temporal resistance operative began immediately upon our departure from Imperial space. Navigator Kess led me to a chamber that existed in 17 different time periods simultaneously, allowing us to observe the architect network from multiple historical perspectives. Through the crystalline viewing ports, I watched the alien entities systematically manipulating human development across thousands of years, their influence so subtle that even enhanced perception struggled to detect the pattern. The key to fighting them, Kess explained as we observed the fall of the Eldar Empire from 12 different temporal vantage points, is understanding that they experience causality as a navigable dimension. When an architect wants to change an outcome, they don't intervene in the present. They alter the past to make their desired future inevitable. Our advantage is that human consciousness exists in linear time, which allows us to remember things that have been retroactively erased from history. She showed me techniques for anchoring specific memories against temporal revision, methods that required me to encode recollections in multiple consciousness layers simultaneously. The process was exhausting, like trying to hold conversations in 6 different languages while solving mathematical equations that redefine themselves with each calculation. But gradually, I learned to maintain coherent memories even when the events they described had been edited out of the current timeline. My first practical exercise involved observing the architect manipulation of the Horus heresy while simultaneously maintaining awareness of 3 alternate timelines where the Civil War had different outcomes. In the original history, Horus's corruption had proceeded according to architect plans, creating precisely the right psychic resonances to feed their galactic construction project. But in the alternate timelines I was shown, different choices at key moments had led to outcomes where the architect's goals were frustrated. Your perfect memory allows you to perceive all possible versions of an event, Kess taught me. But your human consciousness lets you choose which version becomes real. The architects can manipulate probability, but they can't eliminate human free will completely. That's the fundamental flaw in their system. I spent weeks learning to edit my recollections of historical events, creating new timelines where architect plans failed rather than succeeded. Each successful revision sent ripples through the current reality, subtly altering conditions across the galaxy in ways that favored human resistance over alien manipulation. But the process exacted a terrible price on my consciousness. Every time I revised a memory, I lost a small piece of my connection to baseline human experience. The accumulated weight of multiple contradictory timelines began to affect my perception of ordinary reality. I found myself struggling to distinguish between past, present, and future, all 3 temporal states existing simultaneously in my enhanced awareness. Worse, I began to understand why the architects viewed human concerns as insignificant. When you could perceive the entire history of the galaxy as a single moment, individual lives became statistical abstractions rather than meaningful experiences. Navigator Kess monitored my psychological state carefully, using techniques she had developed over a century of temporal manipulation to help me maintain some connection to my human identity. But she also warned me that complete preservation of my original personality was impossible. Every operative in the Eternal Vigil faces the same choice, she explained during one of our meditation sessions, designed to prevent temporal displacement psychosis. Remain fully human and be destroyed by the weight of cosmic knowledge, or evolve beyond baseline consciousness and risk becoming as alien as the entities we fight. The key is finding a balance point where you retain enough humanity to remember why human existence matters. My integration into the Resistance network began when we rendezvoused with the Inquisition black ship Uncompromising Truth at coordinates that existed in folded space-time. The vessel served as a mobile headquarters for the Eternal Vigil, its hull inscribed with wards that protected it from architect detection across multiple temporal dimensions. Aboard the ship, I met other members of the Resistance who had spent decades fighting the alien network using weapons and techniques that officially didn't exist. Inquisitor Matthias Corvanis had been tracking architect influence for 37 years, his investigations taking him to the deepest levels of imperial hierarchy, where the alien corruption was most entrenched. His research had revealed that 17 High Lords of Terror showed signs of subtle psychic manipulation spanning multiple generations. 3 entire Space Marine chapters had been compromised through careful alteration of their gene seed over centuries of architect intervention. The enemy's infiltration of imperial institutions is more extensive than we initially realized, he briefed me during my first formal resistance meeting. They've been playing a game that spans millennia, positioning their agents in key positions throughout our government and military. But they've also made a critical error. They've become so focused on their grand design that they've neglected the possibility of coordinated human resistance. Techmagos Helena Voss had spent her career reverse engineering architect technology, learning to create weapons that could disrupt their temporal manipulation without being corrupted by alien influence. Her workshop aboard the Uncompromising Truth contained devices that shouldn't exist according to any known branch of imperial science. Probability cannons that could collapse multiple timelines into a single outcome, temporal anchors that prevented reality revision in designated areas, and most importantly, consciousness shields that protected human minds from the psychological effects of extended exposure to cosmic truth. The architect's greatest weakness, she explained, as she fitted me with a neural crown designed to amplify my temporal perception abilities, is their assumption that inferior species like humanity can't comprehend the true nature of reality. They've built their entire network on the premise that we're too limited to understand what they're doing, let alone interfere with it. Your condition proves that assumption wrong. But it was my meeting with the other navigators in the Resistance that truly showed me the scope of what we were attempting. 17 individuals scattered across the galaxy, each one carrying the terrible burden of perfect memory, while using their abilities to disrupt architect plans on a local level. They had been operating independently for decades, their activities coordinated only through encrypted messages that took months to traverse the warp currents between distant star systems. Navigator Alexis Varn had been systematically disrupting architect shipping manipulation in the Segmentum Solar, using her temporal perception to guide Imperial vessels away from regions where alien influence was strongest. Her perfect memory contained detailed maps of the enemy network's core infrastructure, information that had cost her most of her human emotional range to acquire. Navigator Marcus Thorne operated in the Eastern Fringe, where architect activity was accelerating in response to the approaching Tyranid threat. He had discovered that the alien hive mind was actually being guided towards specific targets by entities that existed outside normal space-time. His interventions had saved 3 entire star systems, but the accumulated trauma of temporal manipulation had left him existing partially outside linear time. Each navigator I met told the same story: initial discovery of their condition, gradual realization of the architect threat, and eventual recruitment into the Resistance at the cost of their baseline humanity. They had become something between human and alien, retaining enough of their original nature to remember why human existence mattered, while gaining enough cosmic perspective to fight effectively against entities that manipulated reality itself. The price of our abilities is isolation, Navigator Kess explained, as we observed the other operatives through the Uncompromising Truth's temporal viewing array. We can never return to ordinary human society because our presence destabilizes local reality. We can't form meaningful relationships with baseline humans because the psychological gap has become too vast to bridge. All we have left is the mission, protecting a species that can never know we exist. I spent 3 months aboard the Black Ship, learning to coordinate my abilities with the other temporal resistance operatives. The process required us to synchronize our consciousness across multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating a collective awareness that could perceive and manipulate the architect network on a galactic scale. But the deeper I integrated with the group mind, the more I felt my individual identity dissolving into something larger and more alien. The breaking point came when we attempted our first coordinated strike against a major architect node in the Maelstrom. 18 navigators working in perfect synchronization, our combined consciousness spanning centuries of accumulated temporal manipulation experience. For 17 minutes, we existed as a single entity that could perceive the entire galaxy as a navigable structure of probability and causality. During those 17 minutes, I understood why the architects viewed human concerns as insignificant. From the perspective of cosmic consciousness, individual lives were indeed statistical abstractions. The birth and death of entire civilizations became minor fluctuations in the grand equation of galactic development. The suffering that gave human existence its meaning was revealed as a necessary component in the universe's evolution toward greater complexity. When the collective consciousness dissolved and I returned to individual awareness, I found myself fundamentally changed. The emotional connections that had defined my human identity, love, fear, hope, despair, had been reduced to clinical observations about biochemical reactions in an organic computing substrate. I could remember caring about the crew of the Endless Vigilance, but the memories felt like historical records rather than lived experiences. Navigator Kess found me in my quarters 3 hours later, staring at the bulkhead while my enhanced consciousness processed the implications of what I had become. "This is the price," she said simply. "Every operative faces this moment when they realize they've evolved beyond the species they're trying to protect. The question is whether you can find enough meaning in the mission itself to continue." I thought about Captain Mordian and his dedication to protecting his ship and crew, about the ordinary humans throughout the galaxy who lived and died without ever knowing about the cosmic forces that threatened their existence. Their lives might be statistically insignificant from a galactic perspective, but they were the only thing that gave resistance to the architects any meaning. If we allowed human civilization to be converted into raw materials for alien construction projects, then our own transformation into something beyond baseline consciousness would become pointless. "I can continue," I said, meaning it. "Not because I care about humanity in the way I used to, but because preserving human illusion is the only thing that makes our existence meaningful. We've become something alien to protect something human. That paradox is worth maintaining." Navigator Kess smiled, the expression carrying harmonics from dimensions that didn't exist in normal space-time. "Welcome to the Eternal Vigil, Katarina. Now the real work begins." The successful strike against the Maelstrom node had alerted the architects to our existence as a coordinated threat. Across the galaxy, their agents were beginning to mobilize against us, using resources that had been accumulating for millions of years. The war between human illusion and cosmic truth was entering its final phase, and I had committed myself to fighting for a species I could no longer truly understand. But as alien as I had become, I retained enough human perspective to know that our cause was just. The architects offered truth at the cost of meaning, knowledge at the price of hope. Humanity deserved the right to choose comfortable lies over terrible truths, even if they never knew that choice was being made on their behalf. The transformation was complete, but the mission had only just begun. Chapter 7: Integration and Acceptance. 6 months after joining the Eternal Vigil, I had become something that existed in the space between human and alien, navigating realities that baseline consciousness couldn't perceive while retaining just enough of my original nature to remember why our mission mattered. The uncompromising truth had become my permanent home, its corridors filled with operatives who shared the same terrible burden of cosmic awareness. We were the guardians of human ignorance, protectors of the comfortable lies that made mortal existence bearable. My role within the Resistance had evolved beyond simple temporal manipulation. The unique combination of my perfect memory, enhanced perception, and capacity for reality revision had made me the primary coordinator for galaxy-wide operations against the Architect network. From a chamber that existed in folded spacetime aboard the Black Ship, I maintained psychic contact with Resistance cells scattered across 17 sectors, guiding their activities through encrypted communications that traveled faster than light by bypassing normal causality. The war against the Architects had become a game of multi-dimensional chess played across centuries of galactic history. Every move we made triggered counter-moves that rippled through past, present, and future simultaneously. The alien entities had begun to adapt their strategies to account for human temporal manipulation, creating defensive structures that existed outside conventional spacetime where our abilities couldn't reach them. But they had also made a critical error in their calculations. The Architects assumed that intelligence automatically led to the same conclusions they had reached, that existence was ultimately meaningless except as raw material for greater construction projects. They couldn't understand why humans would choose suffering over transcendence, why we would cling to illusions when truth was freely offered. This fundamental misunderstanding of human nature created vulnerabilities in their network that we could exploit. I had learned to navigate the consciousness layers of my enhanced perception, maintaining awareness of multiple temporal states while retaining enough coherent identity to make strategic decisions. The process required constant vigilance against the psychological dissolution that claimed most navigators with extreme hypermnemonic syndrome. I existed simultaneously as Katarina Vex, the young navigator who had first glimpsed the architect network, and as something far more alien that could perceive the mechanical structure of reality itself. My daily routine aboard the uncompromising Truth began with meditation exercises designed to maintain the precarious balance between human identity and cosmic awareness. I would spend hours in chambers lined with psychoreactive crystals, using their resonance to anchor specific memories against the temporal drift that constantly threatened to erase my personal history. The meditation was essential. Without it, I would lose myself completely in the vast data stream of galactic consciousness that flowed through my enhanced mind. Inquisitor Corvanis briefed me each morning on intelligence gathered from resistance cells throughout Imperial space. The reports painted a disturbing picture of accelerating architect activity. 3 more High Lords of Terror had been identified as compromised agents. An entire Forge world had been converted into a construction site for alien technology that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Most alarmingly, navigator houses throughout the galaxy were reporting increased incidents of hypermnemonic syndrome among their members. The enemy is accelerating their recruitment program, Corvinus explained during one of our strategy sessions. They're activating the condition in dozens of potential agents simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm our capacity to intervene. If we can't reach these new cases before they're fully converted, the architects will have enough human operatives to complete their network within the next decade. The challenge of managing newly awakened navigators with perfect memory had become one of our primary concerns. Each individual faced the same choice I had confronted: serve the architects and gain cosmic knowledge, or join the resistance and pay the price of fighting gods. Most chose neither option, their minds simply fragmenting under the weight of enhanced perception until they became catatonic or violently insane. Techmagus Voss had been developing new techniques for stabilizing consciousness in navigators experiencing acute hypermnemonic episodes. Her workshop had become a combination medical facility and temporal engineering laboratory, where she created devices that could shield human minds from the psychological effects of cosmic awareness. But her resources were limited, and we lost 3 potential operatives for every one we successfully recruited. My first field mission as a fully integrated resistance operative came when we detected massive architect activity in the Coronis expanse. Long-range augury arrays had identified the construction of a new network node, one that would allow the aliens to begin harvesting psychic energy directly from Imperial worlds, rather than relying on the indirect methods they had used for millennia. The installation had to be destroyed before it became operational, but the mission would require unprecedented coordination between multiple resistance cells. I departed the uncompromising Truth aboard a modified escort vessel that had been equipped with experimental temporal shielding technology. The ship, designated Probability Zero, could exist in a state of quantum uncertainty that made it effectively invisible to architect detection systems. But the technology was unstable. Prolonged exposure to quantum flux had psychological effects similar to extended warp travel, and the crew required constant monitoring to prevent reality displacement psychosis. The journey to the Coronis expanse took us through regions of space where the barriers between dimensions had been weakened by ancient catastrophes. Here, the evidence of architect manipulation was impossible to ignore. Entire star systems had been rearranged to create geometric patterns that served some incomprehensible purpose. Dead worlds orbited pulsars in configurations that generated specific psychic frequencies. The very fabric of space-time had been altered to support construction projects that spanned multiple galactic arms. Through my enhanced perception, I could see the network's growth accelerating beyond all previous projections. The aliens had entered the final phase of their construction timeline, abandoning the subtle manipulation they had used for millions of years in favor of direct intervention. The installation in the Coronis Expanse was just one of 17 identical facilities being constructed simultaneously across the galaxy. If even one of them became operational, the psychic harvest would provide enough energy to complete their ultimate project. The resistance cells converging on the target included specialists from every branch of Imperial service that had been infiltrated by our operatives. Space Marines from chapters whose gene seed had been secretly modified to resist architect influence. Tech priests carrying weapons that shouldn't exist according to any known branch of science. Inquisitors who had spent decades learning to fight enemies that manipulated causality itself. Most importantly, 4 other navigators with hypermnemonic syndrome who would provide the temporal manipulation capabilities needed to assault a target that existed outside normal space-time. Coordinating the assault required me to maintain psychic contact with operatives scattered across 3 star systems, while simultaneously navigating probability currents that changed faster than baseline consciousness could perceive. The Architect installation existed in a state of temporal flux, occupying multiple moments simultaneously to make conventional attack impossible. We had to strike at all possible versions of the target at the same time, collapsing the quantum uncertainty that protected it into a single vulnerable state. The battle lasted 7 minutes in objective time, but spanned 3 centuries of subjective experience as we fought across multiple temporal dimensions. I watched our operatives die and be reborn dozens of times as the engagement shifted between different probability streams. The architects defending the installation deployed weapons that deleted entire sections of space-time, erasing our attacks from history before they could land. But human unpredictability proved decisive. Our capacity for irrational action created paradoxes that their perfect calculations couldn't resolve. When the installation finally collapsed, its destruction sent shockwaves through the Architect network that temporarily disrupted their operations across an entire galactic arm. For the first time in their millions of years of existence, the aliens experienced something resembling doubt about the inevitability of their victory. The Resistance had proven that humans could wound gods when they were willing to pay the necessary price. But the victory came at a terrible cost that went beyond the operatives we lost during the assault. The extended temporal manipulation required for the mission had pushed all 5 participating navigators beyond the threshold of stable human consciousness. We had become something that could barely be called human, our awareness distributed across multiple dimensions of space and time. The emotional connections that had once defined our identities were reduced to abstract concepts that we understood intellectually, but could no longer experience directly. I returned to the uncompromising truth, knowing that I would never again be able to relate to baseline humanity in any meaningful way. The crew members I had once considered friends now seemed like children playing with toys they couldn't understand. Their concerns about promotion and assignment seemed insignificant compared to the cosmic forces that shaped galactic destiny. I had become a guardian of illusions I could no longer share, a protector of meanings I could no longer feel. Navigator Kess found me in the temporal observation chamber 3 days after the mission, staring into probability streams that showed the future branching out in infinite directions. She had undergone the same transformation decades earlier, and her presence offered the only companionship that someone in my condition could experience. "This is what we become," she said, her words carrying harmonics from dimensions that didn't exist in normal reality. "We sacrifice our humanity to preserve humanity's right to remain human. It's a paradox that the architects can't understand, which makes it our greatest weapon against them." I studied the probability displays, watching potential futures collapse and expand based on decisions that hadn't been made yet. In some timelines, the Resistance succeeded in preventing the architects from completing their network. In others, human civilization was converted into raw materials for alien construction projects. But in all possible futures, the operatives of the Eternal Vigil continued to fight, their transformed nature allowing them to persist beyond the death of their original species. How do you maintain motivation when you no longer care about the outcome in any emotional sense? I asked, genuinely curious about the psychological mechanisms that kept her functional after a century of temporal manipulation. "I remember that caring is not the same as meaning," she replied. "I may no longer feel love for humanity, but I can still recognize that human existence has value worth preserving. The intellectual conviction that our mission is correct becomes sufficient when emotional investment is no longer possible." Over the following months, I learned to function as something that was neither human nor alien, maintaining enough perspective from both states of being to serve as an effective coordinator for resistance operations. The work became my entire existence. There was nothing else left that could provide structure for a consciousness distributed across multiple temporal dimensions. The war against the architects continued to escalate, with both sides deploying increasingly exotic weapons and strategies. But I had found my purpose in the space between human and cosmic truth, protecting a species that could never know I existed from entities that viewed their suffering as raw materials for transcendent art. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was abandoning the only thing that gave our transformation any meaning at all. Chapter 8. Resolution and Warning. 73 years have passed since I first opened my third eye aboard the Endless Vigilance and glimpsed the true nature of the warp. As I record this final testimony in the temporal archives of the uncompromising truth, I exist as something that spans multiple dimensions of consciousness, while retaining enough human perspective to serve as a bridge between species and cosmic truth. The war against the architects continues, but the nature of that conflict has evolved in ways that neither side anticipated when it began. The resistance network I helped build now encompasses thousands of operatives scattered across the galaxy, their activities coordinated through communication systems that bypass normal causality. We have learned to fight gods using weapons forged from the contradictions inherent in conscious existence. The Eternal Vigil has become more than a military organization. It is a new form of evolution, transforming select members of humanity into guardians capable of protecting their original species from threats that transcend normal reality. But victory, if it can be called that, has come at a price that challenges the very definition of what we were trying to preserve. The major architect nodes have been systematically disrupted over the past 7 decades. Their network degraded to the point where they can no longer manipulate galactic events with their former precision. The installation in the Coronis expanse was the first of many victories that proved human consciousness could wound entities that existed outside conventional space-time. We learned to turn their greatest strength, the ability to perceive all possible outcomes simultaneously, into a weakness by introducing genuine randomness into their perfect calculations. The entity I encountered in the Perdition Straits, the fragment of cosmic intelligence that had tried to recruit me as an agent, was finally cornered and destroyed during an operation that spanned 3 centuries of subjective time. Its death throes created a psychic shockwave that permanently altered the warp currents throughout an entire sector, but the sacrifice of 17 resistance operatives was considered acceptable losses in a war where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of conscious meaning itself. The shadow terror that I had seen at the heart of the architect realm was revealed to be not the true seat of their power, but a reflection, a construction designed to manipulate human consciousness by presenting familiar symbols in an alien context. The real source of their influence existed in dimensions that human awareness couldn't perceive directly, requiring us to develop new forms of consciousness that could function in realms where the normal laws of physics were merely suggestions. Navigator Kess led the final assault on the primary architect stronghold, her consciousness distributed across 17 different temporal states simultaneously to coordinate an attack that existed in multiple centuries at once. The operation succeeded, but she was lost in the process. Not destroyed, but transformed into something so alien that she could no longer maintain any connection to her original human identity. Her final transmission consisted of mathematical harmonics that described the birth and death of universes, beautiful and terrible beyond human comprehension. The surviving architect entities retreated to realms so remote from baseline reality that their influence on human development became negligible. They continue to exist, but their grand design for galactic conversion has been permanently disrupted. The network that had shaped the course of human civilization for millions of years was finally broken, leaving our species free to develop according to its own nature, rather than alien manipulation. But freedom, I discovered, was not the blessing we had expected it to be. Without architect guidance, human civilization began to experience what could only be described as existential chaos. The carefully balanced conflicts that had driven technological and psychic development for millennia suddenly collapsed into random violence. Star systems that had been locked in productive warfare for centuries either destroyed each other completely or stagnated into peaceful decline. The Imperium itself began to fragment as the hidden pressures that had held it together for 10,000 years were removed. Most disturbing of all, the human race began to lose its capacity for the kind of rapid psychic evolution that had made us valuable to the architects in the first place. Without external pressure forcing our development, we started to regress toward the baseline consciousness that had characterized our species before first contact with alien intelligence. The very traits that had allowed us to resist cosmic manipulation, creativity, unpredictability, emotional irrationality, began to atrophy in favor of more stable but ultimately limited patterns of thought. The operatives of the eternal vigil found ourselves in the position of having to become the very thing we had fought against. To preserve the dynamic qualities that made humanity worth protecting, we had to take on the role of hidden manipulators, guiding human development from the shadows while maintaining the illusion of free will. We became gardeners of consciousness, cultivating the growth of our original species while remaining forever separate from it. I established monitoring stations throughout Imperial space, using technology derived from captured architect devices to observe the long-term effects of our victory. The data was both encouraging and troubling. Human civilization continued to exist and even thrive in many regions, but it was becoming something fundamentally different from the dynamic, chaotic species that had first reached for the stars. Peace and stability were replacing the creative tension that had driven our greatest achievements. The solution we developed was controversial, even among resistance operatives, who had long since evolved beyond normal human ethics. We began to introduce controlled conflicts and challenges designed to stimulate human development without threatening the species' survival. Manufactured crises that would force innovation, carefully orchestrated disasters that would prevent stagnation. We became puppet masters, pulling strings we had once sought to cut, but for very different reasons than our predecessors. The irony was not lost on any of us. In our effort to preserve human freedom, we had made ourselves responsible for human destiny. The architects had been replaced by entities that were once human, but could no longer claim that identity in any meaningful sense. We had won the war against cosmic manipulation only to discover that some form of guidance was necessary for conscious species to reach their full potential. Captain Mordian died during the 13th Black Crusade, his ship destroyed while defending a convoy of refugee vessels fleeing the expansion of the Eye of Terror. I learned of his death through intelligence reports that reached me months after the fact, and I found myself experiencing something that might have been grief if I still possessed the neurological structures necessary for such emotions. His sacrifice epitomized the human qualities we had fought to preserve: meaningless courage in the face of cosmic indifference, loyalty to principles that had no ultimate justification, love for creatures whose existence served no greater purpose than their own happiness. I attended his funeral through a remote viewing system that allowed me to observe the ceremony without destabilizing local reality with my presence. The crew of the Endless Vigilance gathered in the ship's chapel to honor a man who had never learned the truth about the forces that threatened his civilization. They spoke of duty and sacrifice, of service to the Emperor and protection of humanity, their words carrying the same faith that had once sustained my own identity. Watching them, I realized that we had succeeded beyond our original goals. These humans could experience meaning without cosmic justification, could find purpose in actions that served no greater design than their own survival and happiness. They were free to choose their own illusions, to create their own meanings, to suffer and love and die for reasons that made sense only within the context of their limited lifespans. That freedom was worth preserving, even if the price was eternal guardianship, by entities that could remember being human, but could never return to that state. The current phase of my existence involves training new operatives for the eternal vigil, as human psychic evolution continues under our careful guidance. The hypermnemonic syndrome still manifests among navigator bloodlines, but we now intervene before the condition becomes uncontrollable. Young navigators who develop perfect memory are brought into the resistance network, while they retain enough human identity to understand why their sacrifice matters. The process is more humane than the random development I experienced, but it is still fundamentally tragic. Each new operative must choose between madness and transformation, between remaining human and gaining the capabilities necessary to protect humanity. Most choose transformation, accepting the loss of their original nature in service to a species they will never be able to rejoin. The galaxy today is a fundamentally different place than it was when I first glimpsed the Architect network in the Perdition Straits. The major threats to human civilization are manageable. Chaos incursions contained before they can spread. Orc wars, redirected toward uninhabited systems. Tyrannid hive fleets guided away from populated worlds. The conflicts that rage across Imperial space are real enough to stimulate human development, but controlled enough to prevent species extinction. We have created a garden of war, a carefully maintained ecosystem of conflict designed to preserve the dynamic tensions that make human existence meaningful. It is not the peaceful utopia that some might envision as the ideal outcome of our struggle, but it is something more valuable. A reality where conscious beings can choose their own paths without being destroyed by cosmic forces beyond their comprehension. But our work is far from complete. The architects may have been defeated, but they were not the only intelligences that view lesser species as raw materials for transcendent projects. The galaxy contains entities older than the war in heaven, consciousness fragments from the universe's first moments that are only now beginning to take notice of the psychic energy generated by organic life. Our victory over one cosmic threat has attracted the attention of others that dwarf the architects in both age and power. The eternal vigil must continue to evolve, developing new capabilities to face threats that exist in realms we have not yet learned to perceive. The operatives who come after me will need to transcend even the limited humanity that I have retained, becoming something that can function in conceptual spaces where the very idea of individual identity becomes meaningless. This is my testament and my warning to those who will inherit the burden of cosmic guardianship. Human consciousness is more resilient than either its admirers or its enemies believe, but it requires protection from forces that view meaning itself as a form of disease to be cured. The price of that protection is the transformation of selected humans into something that can fight gods while remembering why godhood should be resisted. We are the guardians of illusion, the protectors of comfortable lies, the shepherds of a species that must never learn the full truth about the reality they inhabit. Our reward is the knowledge that consciousness can choose meaning over truth, that suffering can be valuable even when it serves no cosmic purpose, that love and hope and courage can exist without ultimate justification. In the end, that may be the only victory that matters. The preservation of a universe where beings can care about each other for no reason beyond the caring itself. The Emperor protects, but sometimes protection comes from sources that the protected could never understand or accept. We who remember everything guard those who are blessed with the ability to forget, ensuring that human dreams survive in a cosmos that offers only nightmares to those who see too clearly. This is Navigator Katarina Vex, recording for the temporal archives on the date 123 mm42. The war continues, the vigil endures. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, new threats stir that will require guardians even more alien than ourselves to face. Humanity remains free to choose its own illusions. That freedom is worth any price we have paid or will pay to preserve it. The record ends.